welcome to our 7th tea time chat. Do you have a tea in your hand?
I have my glass.
Your glass. Cheers. This is 7th tea time chat and probably the last tea time chat of the year. So thanks for your interest, support, and contribution in the past few months. And we have a Dr. Kiran Shinde at Trobe University in Australia. And he has been one of our favorite speakers in our tea time chat series. And we'll talk about the recent UNWTO report on Buddhist tourism in Asia towards sustainable development. And Dr. Kiran Shinde, he was a chief editor for this project. Hello, Kiran.
Hello, Jaeyeon.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us. So how did you start the project and how did you end up leading the project?
Okay, the project started somewhere around 2017, and there has been a lot of talk about Buddhist tourism. If you look at some of the past conferences before 2017, there's a big one in Bangladesh in 2015. So there's already some emphasis in the UNWTO regional office in Asia, Asia Pacific Regional Office, as they call it. So they were already trying to put together a proposal for Buddhist tourism study. So it was a team from UNWTO that contacted me and a few other people, researchers in the region, and that's how we started. So as is conventional, as per UNWTO regions, we had the South Asia region, the Southeast Asia region, the North Asia and East Asia region. And we had each region to be looked after by one scholar. So in Southeast Asian study, it was mainly Dr. Victor V, who looked at Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and that cluster. We had a group of researchers from Korea who were looking at Korean study, one contribution from China, and then one contribution from Japan. I was leading, I had to write up all the South Asia, which means it had 7 countries: India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan. So, so besides writing South Asia, I had to look after the entire project completely. The idea was to get a little bit of a footprint across Asia, because Buddhism is one religion that's kind of followed all across Asia, and that's primarily because of the history of Buddhism as it spread over 2,000 years across the subcontinent. So what we wanted is what's actually happening with Buddhist tourism. So in terms of visitation pattern, how is it being managed? What kind of role is being played by different organizations? So in that sense, it was more of an official view of Buddhist tourism in Asia. But the purpose was to see the entire canvas as one and see what were the intra-regional mobilities and what's happening with the kind of different patterns. So we didn't emphasize much on the historical part. Like there are sections on history, but it's fairly limited. It's more to do with what are the major heritage attractions, what is it that people are actually doing there, how are they being managed, and what are the kind of issues related to sustainability and sustainable development. So that was the kind of terms of reference. So it evolved over a few months, trying to exchange ideas of what UNWTO wanted, what kind of data was actually available, and how would we put it all together. So,
yeah, thank you, Kiran. I read the report and it's really impressive, the comprehensive content from across 16 countries, again, across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. So this is really unique and significant, very valuable report. I really appreciate, even for my research as well. I'm sure other researchers take advantage of it a lot. And here's my million-dollar question. So relating to UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, how can Buddhist tourism in Asia contribute to or help those SDGs?
Right. I think that was the core focus, even though it's not spelled out explicitly what goals we are achieving. I think at the back of the mind, we definitely are looking at 5 sustainable development goals that were kind of built into the way we were approaching this project. Uh, so sustainable goal number one, which is no poverty. So how do we really look at using tourism as a poverty alleviation method, and particularly religious tourism? Much of my work in India has been on that kind of a side. Uh, but here we are looking at the multiplier effect and how that can really look into alleviating poverty. So which aspects we should really start picking up and focusing. Now, this is where the report was set. One is to gather the state of the art information, like what's the status now in 2017 and 2018. So a comprehensive account of what's happening in Buddhist tourism. That was the first one. Second, when we started to identify the challenges, then we also had to bring out a more cohesive approach to see across 16 countries that there's so much of diversity, but what are the kind of common themes that we're looking at? And one of them is definitely that many of these Buddhist dominated countries have actually very different kind of economy. They're not highly developed economies. So in one way, tourism can actually help improve situation of related to poverty. Then the second one we was quite subconscious was the good health and well-being. I think Buddhism, as its holistic value-based living, tries to promote that. So how we bring that aspect into tourism. So that's the second goal. The third goal, uh, the eighth sustainable development goal, which is decent work and economic growth. Again, tourism has a very strong multiplier effect. For every one person in direct job, there is a lot more that's happening. More so with religious tourism, particularly, we know that a lot of it is informal, but it can generate a lot of informal economy. And so everybody can actually get some kind of a value-based work. So this is not just working in a factory, but working in sacred places, working with people, trying to help. So there's a whole range of value-based system that can be integrated to provide decent work and economic growth. Uh, Goal number 12, which is responsible consumption and production. Again, I can see the synergies here. These are not explicit goals when we set out, but when we started looking at all these data that was coming out, one of the things that we see is Buddhist tourism, compared to many other forms of tourism, advocates responsible consumption, in a sense, because it's about spiritual development, it's about personal things. So like typical hedonistic tourism, as we call it, we don't find those kind of traits in Buddhist tourism. So there is a very strong response that we can look at when we're trying to address this goal. And then, of course, the very important one is peace, justice, and strong institutions. I think the international cultural diplomacy that comes around Buddhism, and particularly around kind of national leaders and the universal values of Buddhism that appeal to national leaders, I think that's very strong. So based on that foundation, we can look at how peace justice can be developed, and in the process, how we can develop stronger institutions, particularly around uh, Buddhist philosophy. I think Bhutan is already leading that way with its gross national happiness index and all the policies which are tied with gross national happiness. So there is already that layer of Buddhist diplomacy that can be utilized to work with other cultures, right?
Definitely.
So those are the kind of 5 sustainable goals that we definitely think can be integrated well with Buddhist tourism.
I think even a lot of researchers who studying this area can kind of utilize this discussion, right, as a kind of initial the point. And I also understand your report response to UNWTO's focus in 2020 on tourism and rural development, which is also closely linked to community development, right?
Yes.
And one section mentioned Lumbini as a successful community-based tourism case. And actually, I'm also working on community-based tourism case in Bali, surrounding religious, spiritual, and wellness tourism. And we're kind of desperate to find the successful cases as well. So I was very excited to read this. And would you like to elaborate how Lumbini case, community-based tourism case, worked very well?
It's only, okay, how do I put this? See, community-based tourism is a concept where you are getting the community involved in the actual tourism enterprise, right? Where the benefits are shared and there is a stronger economic development and all of that, right? Now, Lumbini case is quite fascinating, and that's not the only case. In fact, I don't want to talk much about Lumbini case because I actually made a field trip to Lumbini in December, and there are kind of differences that we see in the approach. Also, as I remember, we have produced this report based on the desk research and the kind of information that was given to us by national tourism organizations and some of the other research that we did independently. Now, one of the key factors in Lumbini is not so much to do with the Buddhist tourism, but it's actually to preserve the ecosystem in which the Buddhist tourism operates, right? So, for example, there is a very important crane sanctuary, the bird crane. It's called Saras in Hindi and in Nepali also. So that ecosystem of wetlands and birds and all of that is really important. Because it's in a sacred place, it gets a very different value of protection. So that's how community really gets engaged into very environmental friendly, universal values again come up very strongly, where Buddhist philosophies and all of that binds that together. So this is what we would like to call, sacred or deep ecology or sacred ecology, where you put values to this. So community is really involved, not so much in tourism, but actually protection of the crane and all of that. So that kind of really builds up. The real community engagement that we see more is in Bhutan, actually, because in Bhutan, the focus has been particularly on what they call zongs. Zongs are the kind of community settlements that you have. So they're talking about high value, low impact tourism. Now, earlier they had this idea that you want to have tourism because Bhutan is kind of a landlocked country, so you wanted to get tourism. So there was a flux, and then they started thinking that this was really not so good for the cultural fabric and the social cultural fabric. So they have got this high value, low impact tourism now. So everybody who goes to Bhutan has to pay a $250 fee that then gets distributed into the community. A big emphasis there they have put on in creating information basis for tourist guides, because the tour guides actually become very important link between tourists and the community. So they need to understand the community very well, because if the tourist guides are not able to tell people about the prevailing culture, the local culture, then it becomes quite challenging, because how will they behave? And how will they protect? So community-based tourism is extremely important, valuable, and really used quite heavily in Bhutan case. In fact, they talk about happiness is a place. So the logo is like happiness is a place. So if you want people to come and experience that spirituality and happiness, then the people in that place have to come together. So there are lots of these ideas that connect with rural development. Also with Bhutan, it's one of the biodiversity hotspots. So one of the 10 most endangered biodiversity hotspots. So you find the monasteries, all these dispersed into the rural landscape. In fact, 60% of Bhutan is rural. So it becomes extremely important to integrate Buddhist tourism with rural development. And I think we do that quite extensively in this report. Then there is the example of Cambodia, where we are talking about, Buddhist economics. And the whole concept is that you focus the villages and rural livelihoods focus on producing tourist-oriented market products. So like local vegetable, local fruit, furniture, everything. So that becomes more of a cultural exotic. So you convert that from a rural product to a culturally exotic product for a spiritual tourist. So that's how it all gets linked up.
Very interesting. So these are very interesting cases, and I was glad to hear this kind of collaboration of different industries, agriculture and tourism and religions. That's really interesting. But what are the kind of primary challenges across these 16 countries with Buddhist tourism and sustainable development? I know you had substantial discussion on challenges. If you want to share with the audience.
Yeah. See, one of the first ones that I can definitely talk about is as we are talking of 16 countries now, we are talking of 16 countries as of now. But if you look at the history of Buddhism, it was all one Asian subcontinent, right? So Buddhism has traveled across geographically to vast expanses, and therefore, wherever it has gone, it has assimilated into that native indigenous or uh, the culture that was already existing or the religions that were existing. So what we see a lot of times is the hybridization of Buddhism. So and Buddhism by itself has got three major paths, and you've got a whole diversity. So one of the big challenges is the diversity of Buddhist landscape. So from what we just talked about, Cambodian example or Bhutanese example, we're talking of everyday practice at village level, right? So especially when it comes down to that. So there is a temple, there is a monastery, and there's a whole range of things. But you also have the other extreme, which is some of the examples in China. We're talking of live stage performances using mixed media. So, there's already a monastery or a kind of a grotto landscape, and you start projecting images and you have live performances, and there's a whole range of cultural offering. So that range is phenomenal. So that's a big challenge. How do you convert this into a tourism product or a tourism heritage product, right? The second one is many countries are still in the process of archaeological excavations. I mean, what we see of Buddhism now is only a fraction of what exists. So we know only the iconic places, for example, Bodh Gaya or Sarnath or Lumbini. In fact, next to Lumbini, about 40 kilometers, is Kapilavastu, which is the kind of main kingdom city or capital city. And the excavations are still going on. In India, we are now talking about excavations in 21 states, provinces in India. So we don't know much information besides some iconic structures of Buddhist heritage. Unlike Thailand or other places where there's not much of archaeological part to Buddhism, but living heritage part of Buddhism. So where it's an everyday practice. So there also we've still not got into the archaeological aspects, except for things like Ayodhya or some ruins around Phanabrung in Chiang Mai or something around Chiang Mai. We don't have much archaeological stuff. So that lack of research and information is the second primary challenge. And that leads to the bigger challenge, which is the fragile ecosystems in which these sites are situated. Because of excavations, you need to cordon off a lot of area in these places. Now, suddenly, if you've got hundreds and thousands of pilgrims or visitors coming in, it's going to trample on the excavations, and it's going to, have detrimental effect on the historical evidence that we have. So that's the second challenge. The third is, regardless of what Buddhist religion offers, there is very little national recognition of this as a tourism product, right? Except for probably I can only think about Thailand as a classic example where they have built onto this Buddhist identity and heritage for tourism. In all other places, it's still relegated to a lower level. So it's not forming into the main focus of the national tourism policy. Even if it's there, it's only in namesake. At the implementation level, we don't find much happening. So how do we really instigate that action at local level to improve Buddhist tourism? That's our biggest challenge, right? And then that brings down to the next level, which is when you talk of tourism, much of it is private enterprise, right? A lot of private entities come into play. So how do you convince them of that resource value of Buddhist heritage for tourism? Right? So those are some of the few challenges that I've talked about. And one very important one is most Buddhist sites, people are going for spiritual seeking or spiritual reflection, or that whole idea of being Buddha, enlightenment. And when you go there and you find domestic tourists in hundreds and thousands and millions, how do you find peace? So that eternal conflict between a pilgrim and a tourist is absolutely evident in Buddhist sites. So those are some of the challenges that I can think about.
Thank you, Kiran. Even adding to that, what about the COVID context? Is there any effect of COVID in Buddhist tourism and any like creative like tourism products or engagement from Buddhist tourism locations and sites?
See, with Buddhist tourism, the biggest, one of, in our final analysis chapter, I've presented a very, I think it's a kind of a robust and a comprehensive framework of how do we really understand Buddhist tourism in heritage sites. And we've kind of have two actual system where we're talking about. One is a Buddhist follower and this non-follower or non-believer, right? They're going there in the site for a different reason. So classic binaries that pilgrim and tourist and all of that. But in this case, there is a whole range of other possibilities that are happening. That somebody is going with an idea of spiritual enlightenment or seeking, actually goes as a tourist, but comes out as a pilgrim. And that's one of the biggest plank of most of the monasteries, that they welcome these kind of visitors, right? Now, with the challenge with COVID has been, at least as I reflect on to some of these sites, is one, particularly in India, most of these monasteries are owned by international Buddhist organizations, or at least the international governments, because there is very little in terms of the Indian domestic Buddhist pilgrims that are coming and supporting it. These monasteries are supported by foreign and international uh, associations. Now that has completely stopped. Because of there's no movement across borders, it becomes extremely challenging to sustain. Same is the case with Lumbini. So Lumbini has got something like 15 or 16 major monasteries, but when people can't move, then they are not able to survive, right? So they're, but the advantage of that is, as a religious pursuit, most of the monasteries survive on bare minimum. So they know how, they're very resilient, and therefore they are able to actually sustain themselves. Also, the other thing one has to remember is Buddhist tourism, at least in the kind of South Asian context, it's a low income enterprise. It's kind of, in that sense, true pilgrims. They're not splurging money. They're not doing a whole range of things. That's probably because of the Buddhist philosophy of giving monks the more priority, not splurging around, having minimalistic lifestyle. So it doesn't create that kind of a value of tourism that you would anticipate from a standard tourist commercial enterprise, right? So already they're, I don't like to use this word, but they're already operating at a low budget, right? So that makes it easier for them to survive. So they will survive. That's not a big impact, but what will impact is the international movement across. So domestically, in terms of domestic flows, it's not going to be a very challenging situation. It's going to be from the international flows.
Okay. Thank you, Kiran. It was really a good chat. Thanks so much for your answers. Do we have any questions from the audience? I know Zoom says we don't have enough time, but we can log back in when it happens. So don't worry about the time limit. If you have any questions, you can just turn.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
I have a question. Is it
Yeah,
audible?
please. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. It's good morning from India. I'm Dr. Madhuri
Morning.
Sawant. Good morning. I have a question. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Kiran for his report with UNWTO, that is Buddhist tourism in Asia towards sustainable development. I just have a quick question for him relating to the marketing of Buddhist tourism. What are the challenges and what are the way, like, what can be done, when it comes to Asian countries or maybe in general?
Okay. Thank you, Madhuri. Thanks for joining the chat. So it's good to see you.
Yeah.
Now, marketing is a big challenge with Buddhist tourism. As I mentioned earlier, one of the primary challenges is how do you convince people of the heritage value? Because Buddhism, unfortunately, is not the dominant religion in India. Now, we'll unfortunately have to break it down into South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, right? So if you look at the most successful examples, they're actually towards East Asia. where Japan has integrated Buddhist tourism or Buddhist heritage into its mainframe tourism, right? Because of their Shikoku pilgrimages or all the other sites they're talking about, this very well integrated into it. Right? Same as you move towards Korea, a little bit more in Thailand, to some extent, because they have made this as a part of their cultural tourism offering. So it's not necessarily only as religious thing, right? In India and South Asia, particularly because of the colonial legacy that we have, there are two unfortunate outcomes of the colonial legacy. One is that most of these Buddhist sites are controlled by Archaeological Survey of India, as they call it, ASI. And there is only so much you can do with ASI. I'll give you one example why it's a challenge. If you look at Sarnath, which is the place where Buddha gave his first sermon, now that's under Archaeological Survey of India site. In the 200 meters, 300 meters, and 500 meters concentric rings, you can't make any construction. Now, look at any tourism enterprise, you need to have some form of accommodation very close to the tourism attraction. Now, when there is already this spatial disintegration that's happening at the level of site, it becomes extremely challenging to promote tourism. That's one. Second, because of ASI control, people cannot perform any rituals. Now, if you look at any form of religious tourism, it cannot survive without rituals. And if you can't perform rituals, the entire economy that is built around rituals will not develop. So you will need to look at it from not a religious side, but as a tourism attraction. Now, what's the tourism value? The tourism value is archaeology. Tourism value is a little bit of the kind of intangible historical narrative and all. So if you want to enhance that aspect, then you need to focus into that component of tourism attraction, which is, do we have good interpreters? Do we have good guides? Do we have an entire system where people can explain? Now, to my dismal thing in Sarnath, you don't even have guides. There would be only like 50, at the most 11 or 12 or 15 guides. So most of the time the pilgrims come, they come with their own guides. But those guides talk about religious part of Buddhism. So there is a very strong fragmentation that's happening at most Buddhist sites in India. So if you, or else you take it to the other level, which is the cultural exotic, like you have in Bhutan. So where people are looking for that living heritage, that colorful performances, that colorful attires and everything. So that becomes the tourist attraction. Now in India, unfortunately, because we are secular, in constitution, we don't want to emphasize anything on religion. So religious tourism is completely out of the government's ambit. So it becomes merely a lip service. So there's a very deeper problem. I'm not going to go into for everybody else. But I think the first thing is to address, if you want to market Buddhist tourism, you have to first address these major issues of what is this site? Why is it important? How is this communicating to other people? Like if, for example, you go to all Buddhist sites, they're primarily recreational sites for domestic tourists. People will go there as couples. That's quite obvious because they're large archaeological parks. They're huge garden areas because that's how they've been retained. But then we end up in the problems of vandalism. We end up in the problems of antisocial behavior. All of that comes in because archaeological survey will not allow anyone else to do anything there. So those are the complicated institutional mechanisms that we need to address first at the government level. Like who owns and who does what. Then you can bring in private operators and they can manage stuff. But the problem is at the policy level. And therefore you can't market it.
Mm-hmm.
Good, we're back.
Yeah, we're back, right? Good.
Yeah, I'm back.
Hello again.
Yeah. So we'll just wait for
Madhuri is Hope she comes back. But that was a good question, right?
It is something that is of importance. So we'll come back to that question. We can have another question.
Yeah, if we have another question from the audience.
Yes, Dr. Shinde.
Madhuri is back here. So if you don't
Okay.
think,
Hello, Madhuri.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please continue.
sorry.
Yeah.
Now, at product level, we need to have very concrete products that we can sell, right? At cultural diplomacy level, we are already having a lot. So with the conclaves, the Buddhist conclaves that are happening every 2 years, there's a lot of international propagation and everything. But when you come down to the site level, the experience of visitors is not something that will allow them to come back again. So that is where the big challenge is. If a tourism site has to succeed, it has to have a very strong repeat visitation value. And with Buddhist tourism, unfortunately, we don't have that. So even though people who come on pilgrimage circuit, as they call it, Buddha declared the circuit that 4 places one should visit, I've not come across many number of people. There would be very, very few who would have actually come back second time or third time to do a circuit. Now, if you compare that with any Hindu pilgrimage circuit, people would have done those circuits kind of 100 times in their lifetime, the same circuits. But with Buddhist circuit, that doesn't happen. So that's a big challenge. That there is a disconnect from a policy level down to the site level management. Once you achieve integration across this cycle, this hierarchy, then it is easier to market a product. So for example, if you go to Thailand, if you say Chiang Mai Temple, Doi Suthep, right from the national Thai government, which international brochures and everything will talk about Doi Suthep in the same manner, and you go to Doi Suthep and you find exactly the same stuff. Right? So there are priests, there is a whole colorful ceremony and everything. Now, in this case, what happens? You promote Sarnath as Buddha's enlightened place, you go there and you find archaeology. There's a huge disconnect that happens. This is with India. A similar situation is in Bangladesh, Nepal. Sri Lanka is more livelier because Sri Lanka has got almost 60 to 70% Buddhist population. So Kandy becomes the iconic. So what Ayodhya, what Banaras is to Indians, Kandy is for Sri Lankans, right? Same thing is what Ayodhya for Thai people. So that is the big concern when it comes to marketing of site. And the recommendation list is huge. We can talk about it. But the fundamental challenge is these 3 tiers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kiran. Thank you so much, Dr. Kiran. Yeah. I think, I was just thinking about writing a very good, you are well aware that we are running an international center for Buddhist tourism, and it's very new. It's just 2 year old, and we are just looking for the collaboration. So in future, we would be very happy to join you. Especially this point which you noted, that is the policy level. We have to write something or make, do some research related to the policy frameworks of Buddhist tourism. It's very important. Like you're giving an example of other countries, and when it comes to India, it's completely different scenario what we see. And I think many things are needed to be done, like product development and so many other things. I have noted down everything, and then probably we can just have another
conversation on this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Madhuri. And Dr. Praveen had a question, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Jaeyeon. Hello, good morning from India, Dr. Kiran.
Good morning.
Namaste, Praveenji.
Namaskar. Just a observation, although I joined a little late. Buddhist pilgrimage site, especially in northern part of India. And just to tell you that first time I visited Bodh Gaya in 1999, and after this 20 years, so what I have observed about the changes or transformation of a Buddhist pilgrimage site for last 20 years and today, my very quick observation, which I wanted that your comment on that, is what I feel is, especially if you think about Bodh Gaya, I give a term called race of monastery development or race of a monastery construction. Earlier, there were very few monasteries. Pilgrims from all part of the world used to come, perform a ritual, and you were talking about at many places rituals are allowed and many places rituals are not allowed. But at Bodh Gaya, you can see, you can feel real Buddhism because everything is allowed, all the rituals, everything. You feel like a different energy level. But at the same time, there is a difference of feeling between the local pilgrims, local Buddhists versus international pilgrims, international monks, and their behavior, their rituals, their dominance over this Buddhist pilgrimage site. And nowadays, after 20 years, what I can see earlier, Bodh Gaya as a very serene, natural setup. Nowadays, it is occupied by not less than 1,000 monasteries, all grooming all over the world, all over the area, and not allowing local people to be part of it, the development of Bodh Gaya. So my observation is this. So how you think after visiting so many times and writing this report on WTO with this, that whether Indian government or international organization or so-called tourism planners, how we should manage this mushrooming of monastery? Is it good for a Buddhist pilgrimage site, or it is like, it is part of the game that one should go race Chinese temple 5, so there should be Thai temple 4. So this kind of thing, what is my observation? I don't know what is your say on that. So this is from my end.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, Praveen. We've seen this happening, and if I can take the liberty, this is not a part of the report. Honestly, what my response to you is, because it's political. See, for the first thing is it's political, and it's not a fault of anyone else. When you dig deep into this, what happens is, uh, India in the 1960s, and join this history might be of interest to you. I mean, I'm taking liberty of time. In the 1960s, when we had the more tolerant Nehru as our prime minister at that point of time, and there was a recorded uh, thing about decline in Buddhism, and one of the key leaders at that point of time, Ambedkar, was had converted to Buddhism as the new Buddhist, and all of that political history meant that if these places were to revive, you needed to have Buddhist population, right? And India did not have an indigenous kind of Buddhist population that could actually take all of that. So in fact, if you, the history of all Buddhist sites show a very strong connection. This is exactly what I started with earlier when I said we talk of 16 countries now, but historically it has been part of the same landscape, the Asian subcontinent. It's a different kingdoms, different kind of things. So in terms of revival, it has been the Burmese kings, it has been the Sri Lankan monasteries, it's also been to some extent the Koreans who have provided impetus to revive this religion, right? If India did not have its own Buddhist population to support any of this, as a part of cultural diplomacy, Nehru offered these places to international collaborators, right? So people from different countries, particularly Buddhist nations. So Lumbini also works on the same principle that you don't have enough Buddhist population to support Lumbini. So you invite all the Buddhist countries to come and bring their monasteries. Now, this is a part of the way religion works, right? I've written extensively about this, particularly when I look at Bodh Gaya now, it reminds me of uh, Vrindavan to some extent. In fact, I'm writing a paper now which talks about this, that one monastery is not enough. The concept of monastery is it has to provide lodging and boarding for the monks and the people to learn. Now, how they do it is a separate story. I'm not going to go into this. But all kingdoms historically have provided pilgrim lodges or monasteries. In Hinduism, we call them ashrams. In Japanese and Koreans, they will call temple stay and all of that. So you have this urge to build religious infrastructure. So if a religious place has to survive, it has to have religious infrastructure. No amount of hotels or tourism enterprises can substitute that experience. So going and staying in a monastery and then going to a sacred place, it's a ritual. It's a part of the process. So you cannot disassociate it. So that's one part. Second, when we did not have anything in India in terms of Buddhist practice, that's the time when Nehru invited all these people. So if you look at Bodh Gaya, he offered 5 hectares of land next to the temple to the Royal Thai Monastery. That was the beginning, 1960s and 1970s. So it's the Royal Kingdom of Thailand that actually built that monastery. So once they built it, then it was also offered to Burmese. So that's how it was the government enterprise, honestly, to provide for this under the as we call the cultural diplomacy, the soft power of culture, that you want to maintain relationship with your neighbors, particularly under SARC convention and all of that. There were allowances given to these international monasteries to come in. Now, what has happened now? So, what started with a very good intention of providing for Buddhist uh, practices and to make sure that Buddhism survives. And also, one should not forget U Thant, the then General Secretary of UN, who was a Buddhist, Burmese Buddhist by himself, for all this revival on. That's the basic Lumbini design and all of it. So coming to the point now, 30 years down the line, 40 years down the line, what we've seen, and particularly in the last 10, 15 years, is mushrooming of monasteries. It's a part of religious tourism economy. You cannot disassociate that. Now you can bring in international control. So you can bring in government control and say, you can do this or you cannot do this. But you can't find anyone, most of the people or any enterprises in India who will build a monastery in Bodh Gaya. Why would they build a monastery in Bodh Gaya? It's not in their value system. They can build an ashram in Haridwar, but they will not build a monastery in Bodh Gaya. So who will build it? So it's people who follow Buddhism, and these are the people who are coming from outside. Now, how we control that, how we regulate that, that is definitely under the government purview. And that's where it's getting problematic, that we are not, and particularly Bihar is notorious for this. I mean, we also have to look at the local politics of it, right? So it's just not the international politics, it's the local politics of it. You'll hardly find any kind of donation, kind of funding percolating down to the local level. So it's a standard problem of urbanization. So we have to disassociate this problem of urbanization versus the tourism development. And how do we really link it together? Right? So it's a very complex issue. I mean, I cannot answer you straight, Praveenji, on this one, but that's the fundamental. If you ask me whether it is correct or not, as a part of religious tourism economy, it's exactly how the process should follow. In terms of regulation, in terms of participation in local community, that's something that the locals have to ensure. And they have, I mean, there is a lot that can be described in between. So I'm going to leave it to Jaeyeon.
But it's really smart that your report substantially discussed the Buddhist tourism's contributions to UN SDGs. I think
Yes.
that's really, really important for policymakers and government and authorities. Then they'll start, having a different perspectives. Even my research, spiritual tourism, the funders were not interested in, granting money. But when I started talking about SDGs, then, they started listening to me. So that's really, really smart, the contribution to SDGs, because Buddhist tourism has been kind of marginalized in a way, right? In economies and in all kind of sectors, and right. So I think that has a really big value, and Kiran and all of us have so much kind of assignment that work in front of us to develop this even further, right?
That's the purpose, Jaeyeon, of this kind of a multi-country study or multi-country report, to set up what we can actually achieve and see comparatively what countries have made better use of these resources, and how can we really bring those kind of synergies into the local development. Because eventually what we all want is that all these places should develop sustainably with help of Buddhist tourism, because that's the main agency for change here. And we can really bring that out by not coining it only as a religious experience, but as a development agenda, as a livelihood option, as something that can be integrated into the rural economies. Because most of the Buddhist sites unlike the Hindu sites, are actually in the rural, kind of semi-rural, semi-urban kind of a setup, because they've always been excluded. They've been marginal because of their archaeological nature. So there is a lot more that can be done. And that's what this report is trying to do, is saying, this is the state, this is how it's happening. Now, each country should take up these ideas and start building onto very local solutions to many of the challenges that we're talking about.
Definitely. And it was very articulate in each chapter for each country, which I really appreciated. So that was yeah.
That organizing, the conceptualizing, I mean, that's where my skill is, and that's where my job is,
Okay.
as chief editor, to actually frame it in a way that you can talk.
Organized. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, typically what happens, and I think that's the difference between a purely scholarly paper versus something that has of policy value, is in purely scholarly papers, you're free to take any kind of conceptual stand, and you can expand onto that. Much of the books that we write are actually like that. But when it comes down to a report, and particularly of this, where you are comparing many different cultural contexts, how do you bring it out in one way that is meaningful, that can help everyone that is involved into it? Otherwise, there's no point if they're kind of very disparate chapters, right? So in that sense, that's so you'll find this report is also unusual in a little way. It has got a very strong introduction section, and it's got a very strong analytical section at the end, after the case studies are done. How do you make sense of all of this? Typically, what will happen is reports would go, this is this country, this country, this country, and go for it.
Bye-bye.
But here we are actually saying something very, very valuable with that.
And I really like the ending part. Yeah,
the UNWTO was open to this idea of having this kind of a very concrete analytical rigor to it.
I know, Kiran, you did a lot of talking alone. If your throat is still okay, can we get one more question, or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Shawa, did you have a question?
Yes, actually, I have a question about the methods. And first of all, I need to apologize that I didn't read the report. And I'm sorry, but I will. And my question is that I know you conduct a research across 16 countries, which is very fascinating. And I have I'm curious about how did you do this? How did you do this kind of research that involves so many countries, and then come to the report, or an academic article? Yeah, this is my question about the method.
Right. Well, the ideal should have been that we should have been doing this over 3 or 4 years, visiting every Buddhist place, but that was not our mandate. UNWTO was very clear that this was going to be a desk-based research. So whatever is available to us, that's the first port. Then, as it was coming from UN, they had contacted so we developed a questionnaire which had a number of items into it. And you'll find probably that questionnaire in the report, or I don't know if I'm happy to send that across. But this was sent to all tourism organizations. So what we have in each country is called NTOs, National Tourism Organizations. So for example, in India, it would be, in Nepal, it was the Nepal Tourism Board. In tourism, in Thailand, it was the TAT, Tourism Authority of Thailand. So like you identify each national government's tourism organization, Minister of Tourism in India, likewise you find everything, and you send this questionnaire out to them, and we request for data from them, right? So that's one set of information. The second set of information is our own independent assessment of all the tourism reports that are generated. So at country level, for example, there will be always an annual report of tourism statistics that is generated. So we had a look at all of this, because we are just not talking of Buddhist tourism. We are also talking of Buddhist tourism in relation to the other tourism sectors in that country, right? So for example, when we talk about Buddhist tourism, we need to talk about what is its contribution to that country's tourism. So we look at all the tourism statistics for that country. That's a second set of information. The third set of information is looking at researchers. So for example, Jaeyeon's work has been in some of the ASEAN countries, so looked at how they are talking about it. Then there is Brooke Schnedt, who has talked about Buddhist monk church in Thailand. Then you start looking at a number of these reports. Professor Rana Singh has already done some work in Bodh Gaya in the past. So you look at all these scholarly work, and then we put that as a critical reflection onto that. That's why this is a very different report compared to many other UNWTO reports that you'll see, because it was led by somebody from academia and practice who brings these kind of things together. Otherwise, you'll always find this done by most of the bureaucrats or marketing consultants. They bring a completely marketing approach. What we try to bring in here is a very combination of number of approaches. Then we looked at the historical spread of Buddhism. So there's a very strong chapter on that, which was driven by Dr. Victor Wee, who is a historian. So you need to bring in different kinds of perspectives. So that's a fourth set of information. Then the fifth set of information is look at the actual websites of all these organizations that we were interacting with. So you look at, for example, the Bhutan tourism, and you'll see a lot of campaigns and all of that information. So we actually start to verify the information that we received from the national tourism organizations and what their websites were actually showing us and what was the data. So we don't take it at the face value. We do critical reflection of that. And then we bring in the analysis part. So that's the method that has been approached. Then how do we select? So just to give you an example, when we received the chapter on China, it was done based on what was in Chinese, available in Chinese, and what was the content was not structured the way it was to be compared. So we had to again send it back and back and forth. We had to work on the structure, right? Then we realized there was so much of information that technologically China was probably the most advanced nation to use Buddhist heritage. And I'd mentioned it earlier, like they were using mixed media on actual landscapes of Buddhist caves, Buddhist grottos. They were actually projecting Buddhist musicals. They're called something like Zen musical rituals. So it's a very fascinating way that they were actually using it. Now, if we didn't have a robust structure which would allow for those inclusions, then we would have missed that, right? So if you look at tourism heritage attraction, now China, we all know, is in the race for big stuff, right? So in the last 10, 15 years, we had every second or third year, we had one province which would say, we have the giant Buddha, we have got the tallest Buddha in the world, right? So from 71 meters, which was the tallest about 20 years ago, we've now in 10 years, something like 20 to 30 sites. The tallest one now is in Lushan in Henan province, 208 meters high. And this is a completely new Buddhist site. This is nothing to do with archaeology, right? But we have to allow for all of this when we design a methodology for a report. Right? Does that answer you, Shah?
Thank you very much. It helps me a lot because I am planning a project in East Asia, yeah, which might include 5 countries. So I'm a little bit confused about the method part. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Shah. Thank you so much, Kiran. Before we go, do you want to say anything as a closing mark, Kiran? I know you've done enough talking.
Just disclose the year.
But this was really nice. I really appreciate the questions, very interesting questions, right?
Yeah, I think it's always very good to have an engaging conversation. So the idea is not to have one representation, but just to get a different kind of sense. Because when we are doing a little monologue or presentation, I'm just giving out information. I'm not talking, I'm not getting what people are saying. So I think by opening up these conversations, it's good. I'm also happy that we've gone from half an hour to 1 full hour, which is great. That's, to me, that's a good sign of having something worthwhile. So, and I must thank you for having this time chat. I mean, this is my third chat.
I
The
think
first
it's
one was the
your
Religious Tourism
third time.
Environment book. Yeah. No, I think I found this format quite interesting and quite exciting to be able to share some of the stories that we would not do in formal presentations, for example.
Yeah,
So thank you
Kiran,
very much.
you've been so helpful. You've been so great. And yeah, I miss going to conferences, but I also miss like chatting about our research during tea times and lunchtime, where I always have a better collaboration, after. So I wanted to kind of recreate that kind of coffee break chats at our conferences.
Happy to take any conversations offline by any of the participants if you want. We are already known to each other in many different capacities, but the idea is to take this study further. Now, when I did this study after this, as I said, I've already started a live project on Buddhist tourism in India and Nepal. I'm doing a fair amount of work on that project. But the more I see it, I think it's opened up a whole new direction of thinking about tourism in many different ways. The regional aspects of it, the international networks that come into it, the internationalization of religious networks that we're talking about, which has been not so much into focus in the study. So in terms of research agenda, there's huge stuff that's coming out. And I'm pretty excited about picking this.
Me too.
I have one
Especially,
question.
sorry. Oh,
Last question, please, Dr. Kiran.
Yeah.
I'm very curious to know about the current research you're doing on Buddhist tourism and the upcoming research you're thinking of doing.
Yeah, so currently, so after the report was over, one thing that we realized was most of the information that we're, as I said, and that was a part of methodology of this report, is the information from the national tourism organizations coming to us, right? Now, surprisingly, we didn't get much response from, of all the places, India.
Oh,
Yeah.
Because this is supposedly the hotbed of Buddhist tourism, and that the reason is very clear that it's still not in the mainframe that we're talking about. It's still very superficial. But Pakistan, we did not even get any reply, so we had to rely on whatever material we were getting it. But surprisingly, there's so many sites in Pakistan that are related to Buddha. Afghanistan, the whole Buddhist art that came in from Takshila down there, it's huge. But we don't have information. So there are limitations onto it. But most striking for me was the absence of real hard information about what's happening in India with Buddha. There are kind of sporadic studies about Bodh Gaya, the most iconic one. But if you look for Kushinagar, for example, there's nothing. We talk of pilgrimage circuit. We talk about all sorts of grand plans that Indian government talks of, says pilgrimage circuits and all. So I was very interested in knowing exactly what's happening. So I did a field study last December, and I was fortunate to have a couple of days spent with Professor Rana Singh in Banaras when I was in Sarnath. So I have looked at the 4 major sites: Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, Lumbini, and Kushinagar. And I did some field work based on my interviews and everything. So I was actually now started to publish onto it. But the idea is to see how, one of the questions that Praveen asked earlier, what do you think about the monasteries? But I think I go beyond that and say, how sustainable is the current model, or how do we achieve sustainability in this? Because one of the key problems or key challenges is in India and Nepal or South Asia, what we see as Buddhism is what I've called in one of my papers now, imported Buddhism. So it's something that's coming from outside. So how does it, something that comes from outside gets connected with local communities, and how do we achieve sustainability there? So what's happening in tourism infrastructure, what's happening with the environmental situation. But I've realized in Buddhist tour circuit, we don't even need to talk about environment. We first need to talk about socio-economic sustainability, because environmental sustainability will come much later. So that's the project that I'm doing. So I've got some good understanding of what's happening in these areas and now started working onto it. The idea is also to start talking to people in the policy level agenda. One of my arguments, and this will come very soon in one of the papers, is that the whole concept of pilgrimage circuit is a failed concept in India.
Okay.
For example, we
Looking
talk
forward.
about,
Yeah.
sorry, and I'm
Yeah. Please continue.
providing evidence for that. So when that's what field research tells us, that there is one thing that is called policy, and when we actually get into the field, you start realizing what's going on here. You look at numbers, you look at people, you talk to them, you get all. So that's my research is all right now, is to look at the long-term sustainability of Buddhist sites,
Okay.
particularly because they're also World Heritage sites. So Bodh Gaya, Sarnath.
Okay. Looking forward to read all your research. Yeah.
So it will come into instruction. Happy to collaborate. I'm collaborating with a couple of other people, and I'm also wanting to do kind of cross-country studies. So that's one of the things that Jaeyeon and me are trying to do, is look at possible synergies of working similar methods in Thailand or Vietnam, and see what it leads to. So that's where
One of my core interests, it is related to co-branding of the sites. So I'm working on that right now. How the two countries like Japan and India, I've been visiting Japan many a time. So we are working on these areas, how to co-brand the destinations and how to increase, and moreover, the socio-economic impacts of the sites also.
Interesting. One of my 2 months ago, I did a presentation on what is called co-creation of Buddhist heritage. The whole concept of co-creation and how it applies to Buddhist heritage. And
So
Buddhist
who was
tourism.
the writer?
Sorry?
Yeah. Who was the speaker? Who was the speaker?
I gave the presentation.
Okay, you gave the presentation. Okay.
Co-creation. It was a conference on co-creation by one of the Dutch universities. There's
That's great.
Yeah. On co-creation.
So nice.
Yeah.
That's great. This
Thank
was
you.
a really engaging session. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Kiran, and congratulations again for the fantastic report. That is extremely useful for all of us. And thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for such inspiring questions. So I hope I see you again. We collaborate in the future.
Sure. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranaji. Thank you, Praveen. Thank you, Madhuri. Thank you, Shah.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.
And it is so lovely to see Dr. Madhuri house as a Chaitya. Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Madhuri is such a beautiful.
This is
In fact,
this is
I
my
know.
Chaitya hall.
Yeah, I know. And we have seen your picture of your house, just like a complete Buddhist tourism product. So it is a pilgrimage
lovely,
center.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, all
Bye-bye.
of you. So nice meeting you too. Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye.